Hello, this is our weekly check-in here with some fresh content. And so we are returning to our discussion. This is part 3 of Confronting the False Concept of Race. And we are looking at species a change here in this segment. So we spoke about Linnaeus, who came up with the Latin nomenclature, the Latin classification system for classifying living things, animals, and plants. And we were noting the words species and genus. Well, after Linnaeus, both of these words, species and genus, were commonly used in modern biological classification systems with slightly different definitions. In the mid to late 1700s, species began to take on a new, more specific definition in scientific circles as a biological term, and the fact is that definition is still being debated even today. But by and large, the definition had changed, and it was a radical change. Instead of there being a dog species or dog kind, which is how that word species was originally understood, now there were many dog species. They started to classify wolves and coyotes and dingoes and domestic dogs as different species. Some other examples: the black panther and the spotted jaguar of South America. Well, for a time, because of this new definition of the word species, they were classified as separate species. Well, we have things like DNA now and other means of observing, and we understand that the black panther is merely a color phase of the same animal. The spotted jaguar can come in a melanistic or black phase. This is true of many different animals. There are black wolves. We had a black fox residing in our locales for a long time. He was a large male black fox, and he actually was documented by a local photographer from the time that he emerged from his den, and I saw him in our backyard a couple of times, striking against the snow in the wintertime. A completely black fox with the 4 white feet and the white patch like they have and the white tip on its tail, but where there was red, where there would be red, all black. Still the same animal. He was born into a litter of red foxes, and both of his parents were red foxes, but he was a melanistic color phase of black. In more recent times, speaking of the jaguar, they used to classify the ones in Central America and the ones in South America as separate species, and this animal used to at one time range into the southwest of the United States, and his range, they're trying to help his range to include North America again. He's from Mexico into Texas. He's ranging back in. But all of these used to be classified as separate species, when in fact they are just the same wide-ranging animal. Similar things have occurred with the African leopard, which can also have a melanistic color phase. Foxes have been confused and classified as different species based on color. I saw something very recently. I happened, because our granddaughter was here, happened to watch Kratz Creatures, a little bit of an episode, and there was a mention about the gray wolf, and just very casually, the words were spoken that the gray wolf occurs in Europe, Asia, and North America. Well, that just wasn't the case. After this hijacking of the word species that we're talking about today, those animals occurring on those different continents were classified as different species, but now they know by DNA that they are in fact the very same animal. The European red fox was imported to North America, where it was able to interbreed with our native gray fox. And so that just added to the variation in colors and patterns and sizes of the fox in North America. There's even mounting evidence of the fox being dog kind. And we'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. The red wolf in Florida, for years classified as its own species, now understood to have come about because of hybridization between coyotes and wolves to form a new population that became the red wolf. Now, about the fox and the association with dogs, did you know that the fox is now fast becoming the next designer pet, the next designer dog? It's true. You can look this up. There was a Siberian fur farm. They were raising foxes in captivity for their pelts. And, there was a study done whereby they separated the foxes by their temperament. The ones that were antagonistic and vicious toward humans, they were kept apart, and a breeding population was done with those, separate in isolation from the others. And then they just kept breeding together the ones that were more conducive to human contact and handling. And guess what? As their docility and affection for the humans increased, some other things started to change. The ears, which are supposed to be erect, started to be floppy. The noses started to be shorter and turned up. And things like spotted coat patterns started to appear. Curly tails started to appear. They started to look like little Pomeranian dogs. And now you can get designer foxes for your pet. This is happening. That's the new trend. And what they found out is that by selecting for temperament, they were inadvertently also selecting for these other recessive traits, which altered the appearance of these animals. Same animal, just different color patterns and features. There's a lot of concern about bear species in North America. You'll hear about growler bears and pisleys, where grizzly bears and polar bears interbreed, and there are documented cases of Kodiak bears and grizzly bears and black bears and different bear types interbreeding in the wild. Well, this has probably been going on for eons. Well, I'm sure that it has. But these things are kept quiet unless they can be used to manipulate some agenda, such as trying to show that this is because of global warming, etc., etc. Well, it's the mechanism inside the created kind for being fluid, being able to move into different environments and take on these changes that are more conducive to those environments. Nothing more than that from a biblical frame of reference. Is the giraffe disappearing? You'll find statements about that. But this is what happened. In the common biblical understanding, in that sense of the word species was still viewed as the biblical kind. But as the change occurred and the new understanding with the scientific term gained popularity, well, this led to problems. When theologians and members of the church said fixity of species, meaning fixity of biblical kinds, people readily saw that there were variations among the species by the new definition, and they thought, but species do change. Of course, no change has ever been shown that made a change from a dog into a cat. Dogs were still dogs, cats were still cats, and so on. However, this bait and switch fallacy had taken place. Now, where we're headed is to talk about the false concept of race when it comes to human beings. And it's the same kind of situation here. The bait and switch fallacy had taken place, and Christians who were teaching fixity of the species or kinds, but the definition of species had changed right out from under them. Now, we started out as a subtitle with this, that we were asking the question, can a Chihuahua help us understand how we can confront the false concept of race? And since we've been talking about kinds as in dog kind, well, yes, we can look at this. If someone were to ask the question, were Chihuahuas on the ark? And someone would answer yes to that question, well, this would reflect actually this historical hijacking and therefore confusion of this term. Bible-believing people, because they were duped by this hijacking of this term, they thought, when society starts to enforce this idea that you look at a Chihuahua, that's a different species than a St. Bernard, reflecting that concept, well, then they say, well, they must have been on the ark then, because every kind was on the ark. If kind starts to mean species in this new way, well, see the problems we have? But here it is with regard to the Chihuahua. The earliest of these were found at Tres Zapotes in Veracruz, Mexico, which date to 100 AD. There is indirect evidence that a Chihuahua-like breed of dog was in Mexico over 1,400 years before the first Europeans arrived there. Dog effigy pots dating to around 1325 AD were also discovered in Georgia and Tennessee that appeared to represent the Chihuahua. What's the conclusion? Well, Noah never laid eyes on a Chihuahua because Chihuahuas came much, much later than Noah. But what happens is Christian people end up looking ignorant when observing that species by the new definition do change. Of course, in reality, this was merely the variation within the created kinds. For example, dogs could be observed changing into something different, still dogs, but not looking like other species by the new definition of dogs. So it appeared that the created kinds were becoming new species by the new definition, even though the animals did not change into a different kind of animal. So it appeared that the Bible and the church was wrong. Perhaps the most influential critique of fixity of the species came from Charles Darwin, whose book On the Origin of the Species tackled the Victorian era misunderstood idea of fixity of the species. Even though Charles Darwin in his works never used the term fixity, as in fixity of the species, but Mr. Darwin studied many creatures during his travels and realized there was variation and not fixity by the new definition. So what were the implications of this? Well, the results were devastating to the church. People began doubting the Word of God as a result, walking away from Christianity and embracing an evolutionary philosophy. George Bentham, writing May 30th, 1882, to Francis Darwin regarding his father Charles's ideas, had this to say, and I've got small print here, so I'm going to put on the specs so I can read this. I have been throughout one of his most sincere admirers and fully adopted his theories and conclusions, notwithstanding the severe pain and disappointment they at first occasioned me. On the day that his celebrated paper was read at the Linnean Society, July 1st, 1858, a long paper of mine had been set down for reading, in which, commenting on the British flora, I had collected a number of observations and facts, illustrating what I then believed to be a fixity in species, however difficult it might be to assign their limits, and showing a tendency of abnormal forms produced by cultivation or otherwise to withdraw within those original limits when left to themselves. He was right. His observations were correct. But as he confesses, he was so blown over by Darwin's paper. I'll read on. Most fortunately, my paper had to give way to Mr. Darwin's, and when once that was read, I felt bound to defer mine for reconsideration. I began to entertain doubts on the subject and on the appearance of the origin of species. I was forced, however, reluctantly, to give up my long cherished convictions, the result of much labor and study, and I cancelled all that part of my paper which urged original fixity, and published only portions of the remainder in another form, chiefly in the National History Review. See how that happened? How sad. Even today, an objection commonly leveled at the Bible is that it claims that species are fixed. Now, if you're confronted with that, a good response would be, to which definition of species are you referring? By the old definition of kind, biblical kind, creationists would agree, but would probably, it would be better to state in modern English as fixity of the created kinds, so as to not confuse the issue. The idea of one kind changing into another can be argued against based on the fact that no such change has ever been observed. After Darwin's book, many churches gave up fixity of species by either definition and began taking compromised positions such as theistic evolution, which basically means giving up Genesis for a molecules to man evolution and then picking up the text again with Abraham. Realizing that the church had been duped by a bait and switch fallacy, however, does provide us with a valuable learning tool. When people fail to understand history, they often repeat it. All of these animals' ancestors that we have discussed, horses, donkeys, zebras, tigers, lions, whales, and dolphins, were created with genetic diversity within their various kinds by the older definition of species. Through time, the processes of natural selection, mutation, and other mechanisms have altered that original information, decreased it really, or degenerated it, because that's what you're looking at with a dog, a domestic dog. Things have been removed from that picture to make him not a wild animal that can live on his own in the wild, but on a domestic animal dependent upon human beings. It's the same thing like with turkeys. You hear so many stories about how turkeys are stupid. Well, we made them that way for our ease of keeping them in domestic form. All right, domesticity, I started to say. All right. So there's a lot of variation now within the kind. We see that's built in to the original model. Great variety can be observed in the offspring of animals of the same kind, just as the same cake recipe can be used to make many different cakes with various flavors and colors. Sometime I can tell you about some dove hybrids that appeared in our locale, and I still hear a male descendant of theirs once in a while in our neighborhood. I can tell you a little bit about that some other time. But hybrids have a portion of the same genetic information as their parents, but combined in a unique way to give a very unique looking animal. What an amazing diversity of life God has created for us to enjoy. The study of created kinds is a very exciting area of research, and I hope that this might encourage you to look into it. Whether studying duck-goose kind, elephant-mammoth kind, camel-llama kind, apple-pear kind, or others, the field of baraminology is a great place for biologists, botanists, geneticists, and paleontologists who look at extinct kinds to get immersed into creation research. I wish you well on your journey. We will start looking at applications within humankind in our next segment. Thank you very much. Appreciate your tuning in. Please look to the ways whereby you may contribute to this, my work here. I hope you appreciate it, and look down below for the addresses for our PayPal, etc., and spread the word. Thank you for being here. Much love and respect. Bye for now.